We'll go right into user-defined time. This allows us to use this material time switch here. So this is interesting because now no matter where we are in time or what the particle age is, it's going to use whatever material time is being piped in here. Right now we're just going to use the parameter interface, and we'll say 18. And so of course all the particles are going to be the same, and they're all going to use 18. Okay, you might think, well, that's not very useful. What can I do to make that a little more interesting? Well, you could do something like add a random helper. So each particle is going to generate a random value anywhere between 0 and, say, 300. And we'll do that per frame iteration. And so now each particle is just going to go ahead and generate a random number and use that as the frame lookup for the material. And you can see we get some pretty wild results. First one's 53, second one 291, and second one 2, or third one 2. So they could be all over the board, totally random. The random's not so helpful. I usually see these things being used where maybe you want to take a particle age and do something like use a float helper, take that particle age into the float, multiply it by, say, 0.3, and then feed that into the material time. So we'll just come out here to frame 100, and what we'll see is that this particle is now 100 years old, and so 100 times 0.3, so it should read out 30. So we see that right there. And of course this guy just got born. He's 0 already, and 0 times 0.3 actually be 0 as well. So we'll go ahead and remove that float. So anyway, that's just kind of a one way that if you use user-defined time, you can manually control the input value. You can dynamically process it through either data channels, memory operators, etc. You can have it based on calculating the distance to an existing object, all kinds of things. Let's take a look then at the next method. We're going to skip operator time for right now. We took a look at particle absolute, age absolute, which just uses whatever the particle's actual age is to look up the material. And then the last one is particle, or next to last, we'll go back to operator time in a second. But particle age relative is an interesting one because it uses the particle's lifespan and calculates where in his lifespan that is, and then uses the material time setting here as a multiplier. So we'll go ahead and illustrate this we'll come back to the particle draw, and we're just going to set our lifespan now, instead of 300, to be 100. And what we'll see is that, okay, so this particle's born at 0. We come out here, he's going to die at 100. So let's come out to frame 50. So he should be half his age. So now the material has this MOV that we've got has 300 frames in it, the countdown MOV. So when this particle here is half of his lifespan, and material time is set to particle age relative, so it's 50% of his age, so 50% of our material is going to be 50% of 300, so 150. But then we also have this material time multiplier here. We'll go ahead and render the result, of course. Now 100 here is going to, you could almost think of it as a percentage term, so 100% of his lifespan relative. So it should be 50. Okay, and now we're going to go ahead and see what happens when we modify this material time. Let's say, okay, well, he's 50% of his age, but we want to multiply that by another 50. So we would expect it to be 25, 50% of half of his age. And there we see that. So this is kind of an extra layer of control that you can use to modify that material time. Now let's take a look at the last setting, which is operator time. Every operator in thinking particles has an on and a time input. This allows you to control any animated parameters independently. You can see the time input's not connected to anything right now, which means that it's going to go ahead and use either the dynamic set time or just the overall general max time. Let's come up to our particle draw. Let's double check our particle lifespan is set to 100. So come back to material time. We're set to operator time. It's going to go ahead and ignore this material time input. And pretty straightforward. As we come out to frame 40, it's also going to render frame 40. That's how long that operator's been affecting the particles. When we come out here as well, now we're going to be on frame, let's get to frame 200. Actually, not quite there. We want to see at least 2 particles being drawn. Now, the max time is 180 in frames. And so what is going to happen is this material time is going to be using 180 as the reference. So this is how long it's been active. And so both particles are going to get that 180 for their time. Now the way that we can actually exert some control over this is by using a helper. We'll go ahead and just for example's sake we're going to use a time base. And time base allows us to alter how time is being applied. In this case we've got a particle connection, so it's going to be per particle. Then we're going to make this time input and connect it to the operator's time. Now right now the time factor is set to 100, and so what we're going to do is just go ahead and say we'll make it 50%, and for now we'll have no variation. So what this will do is each particle is going to have his own time that's being calculated based on the max time, and it's going to come into time base and get slowed down by 50%. And so the material time coming in is actually this slowed down time per particle. So again, we'll come back out to frame 180, and what we should see this time is a 50% of this time, which will be 90. Okay, and then let's go ahead and throw some variation in there. And you can see that there. Okay, so it's just important to remember that if you do want to use the operator time, we'll take a look at time base and some of the other helpers in another example. Also definitely check the help file. It gets a little heady, so you want to make sure you understand it. And also remember that every operator has its own time input. So if you want to animate any parameters on the object or on that operator, and then want to have control over it independently, you can feed in a different time lookup to use.